Hi, everyone. My name is Adeniran Adeniran. I am the project lead of the Indigenous Data Initiative at the First Nations portfolio at the Australian National University. We work collaboratively on this project, and we will be that we'll be talking about today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Afina Gray, and I am the project manager within the team and supporting Kristen in our ISU unit. I'm still quite new in this role, but really enjoying working with everyone. I am recently from Wellington, New Zealand, where I actually worked at the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, supporting research in science and innovation. So I'm very happy that I can be here. I was able to support our Indigenous community over there and excited to bring my passion for that to support our Indigenous communities here and the work that we get to do together.
So today we're going to be sharing some insights from the Improving Indigenous Research Capabilities project. Now, we're quite a way along in this project. We started back in late 2021, early 2022 in our first phase, building the foundations of an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research data commons. So in phase one, we brought together partners from within the academy, but importantly also from the Aboriginal and community controlled sector and from government agencies, from galleries, libraries, archives and museums, and also Indigenous private sector partners and collaborators. So in that first phase, we established the social and technical architecture for Indigenous research data for the nation. We did a lot of work on developing Indigenous data governance principles, metadata standards, and an IDN data catalogue. In that phase, we also delivered a variety of training programs and developed a number of metadata and other catalogue tools, including a fair and care scoring tool, which I will show a little bit later in this talk today. But also importantly, we really did start building that baseline for an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research data commons. Now we're across into phase two, which started in 2024, and we're really in an expansion phase now. So we're extending and scaling on the foundations we built in phase one, including the Indigenous data catalogue and integrating with national repositories. So we've been implementing governance frameworks across major institutions or working with them to develop them. We've developed spatiotemporal tools and secured keeping place repositories and different options for Indigenous data to secure it in the long term. We've also strengthened Indigenous-led capability building and international collaborations. And the way that we work at the moment, you can see up on the slide here, we have it organised into a foundation stream and 4 substreams of activities. For our foundation stream, which is the central stream that also works across all of the others, we are working on Indigenous data governance and sovereignty activities. We also have substreams that include Indigenous data catalogue resources and extensions, Indigenous spatiotemporal frameworks and infrastructure, data capability building for digital futures, and Indigenous repositories and data rematriation. And really collectively, these streams aim to improve Indigenous data practice and governance practice nationally. So, I've gone one too far. Do you want to go back? So just to introduce to you the project team, the leadership. Now, Professor Marcia Langton, who I assume most of you would know of, is the lead of this project. She does apologise that she can't be here today. She's actually convening a truth-telling symposium down in Melbourne. But she said to send her apologies and she sent us instead. Apologies to you all. Now, one of the things that I really do want to highlight in this project that it is Indigenous-led in all ways. So the lead of the project, Professor Marcia Langton is an Aboriginal woman. We are partnering with the community controlled sector who will lead a lot of the activities and co-design a lot of the activities with us. But also we have leadership from across different organisations and institutions of Indigenous leaders within each of those. We do have an incredible team of researchers with expertise from a variety of domains and disciplines, and an incredible project team. I'm not going to read everyone's names out or every institution out, but you can see there is a very large variety and breadth of different partners working on this project. Yeah. So before I go any further, I want to provide some definitions for you for a couple of terms that seem to confuse many people and are also somewhat contested. So I want to start first with Indigenous data, which is a term that many people misinterpret. So I'll give you the Indigenous Data Network's definition, and then I'm going to give you a definition for Indigenous data governance. So we see Indigenous data as data generated intentionally or not by, about, or for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Indigenous data refers to information in any format or medium collected, analysed, stored and interpreted within the context of Indigenous individuals, collectives, populations, entities, lifeways, cultures, knowledge systems, lands, biodiversity, water and other resources. It includes data collected, used or stored by any agency, department, laboratory, organisation, corporation, statutory body, university or research institute conducted by, with or about Indigenous people or peoples, and data that Indigenous communities have generated and maintained themselves. So there are many disciplinary areas who are a little bit confused about what consists of Indigenous data, so we're always very clear about our definition. Across Australia, most data collections will hold Indigenous data. So in the panel earlier today, they were talking a little bit about that, but I just wanted to make it very clear the breadth of Indigenous data. It is held in institutions everywhere. It is held by Indigenous people themselves, but also by our universities, by our government agencies, by the private sector. It is held all across the nation, and a lot of it is very siloed. Now, moving on to a definition of Indigenous data governance. It refers to the principles, practices and systems by which Indigenous communities and peoples exercise control over the collection, ownership, management and use of data that is considered relevant to them. It recognises the unique rights, interests and needs of Indigenous peoples regarding their data, and aims to ensure that data is collected, stored and used in a manner that respects their self-determination, cultural values and sovereignty. So it's really Indigenous data governance that sets the foundations for data democracy at the community level and supports Indigenous access, generation and use of data. So within the Improving Indigenous Research project, we operationalise these principles primarily through the CARE principles. I imagine most of us in the room know what they are, but CARE stands for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility and ethics. So when we're talking about collective benefit, we're talking about that data really should be used, Indigenous data should be used to benefit Indigenous people and communities. Authority to control refers to that Indigenous people should be able to determine how data is managed. Responsibility refers to ethical and culturally secure practices in the data handling processes, and ethics refer to the respect for Indigenous rights, knowledge systems and cultural protocols. I could go on, but this is just to give an overview to those of you who are not aware of these particular terms or are a little bit confused, because there seems to be a lot of confusion out there. Yep. So Indigenous communities really do have limited authority over their data. Governance systems and the data are fragmented, as I noted before. And the FAIR and the CARE principles, which we see in the Indigenous Data Network and within this project as going hand in hand, unfortunately, they're not consistently applied. This leads to poor discoverability, orphan data sets, and missed opportunities for Indigenous-led capability development. So generally across Australia, and this also applies internationally for Indigenous data, governance systems are fragmented. The discoverability issue is significant. As a researcher, my background's in medical anthropology, and I've spent a lot of the last 15 years working with communities across Australia. A lot of remote communities across the top end, but also communities in other states and territories. One of the constant issues that is raised in all of the work that I've done across different areas is the complaint that there's always a story or 10 or 50 stories within every community that you're in, that a group of researchers came in, 10, 15, 20 years ago. They undertook research, but they've never known where that data went. And then there's an issue on top of that they'll say not only did they come 15 years ago, there was another group that came 10 years ago. The same thing happened. There was another group that came 5 years ago. There was another group that came 3 weeks ago, collecting similar data, but there's never any access or governance from the community for the community themselves. So there's another significant issue with Indigenous data across the nation, and that is of orphan data sets that really are at risk of cultural loss. So whether that is all of the data that has been collected by researchers across Australia, or the data that's held by communities themselves, whether they're in paper form or other formats that have not been digitised, or because there is a lack of resources to maintain and digitise or manage the digital assets, there is significant risk for Indigenous data across this nation. And another significant issue, that capability development across our nation, there are so many opportunities that remain under-realised. So when we're thinking about Indigenous data, really it's central to cultural identity and self-determination. Misuse of it perpetuates harm and inequity. Fragmentation undermines national efforts to improve equity, and significantly, this I'm referring here to the closing the gap priorities. So essentially, Indigenous communities really need to have greater authority of how their data is collected, managed and used. Again, as a researcher, I've been working predominantly looking at issues of alcohol management and family violence in my earlier career. And there's a significant issue that the communities who are running their own programs never have the same access to data that governments do. So they don't have access to what the hospital data is. They don't have access to the police data. They barely even have access to the data that they collect themselves under the premise of KPIs for government services. There's a massive issue that Indigenous communities are the best people to manage their own problems, or to ensure that their priorities are set in a way that their own communities are benefiting. And if they do not have equitable access to this data, if they are not able to govern this data, we are going to continue to see the cycles of inequity, and gaps are not going to close. So what is the value in addressing some of these problems? Well, through this project, what we're wanting to do is to empower communities through governance, using Indigenous governance. There is the value of enabling the preservation of cultural knowledge. It enables building culturally secure national infrastructure that benefits not only Indigenous communities, but our whole nation. The value proposition also is in strengthening fair and care compliance across Australia. We also know that fair and care compliance is not so great internationally. We have a lot of international partners. There is growing awareness internationally of the importance of these principles and embedding them in our national practices. But we have a real potential here in the work that we're doing for Australia to become an international leader in this area. Next. Yep. So some of our project goals, again, are to empower communities, preserve this cultural knowledge and build ethical infrastructure to position us as a global leader. We plan on doing this by building a national Indigenous data commons, research data commons, embedding governance principles across all institutions and organisations that hold Indigenous data. From the perspective of the project, we look at 5 different custodian and stewards who hold Indigenous data. So that is obviously research institutions such as universities, that's government agencies and institutions. That is also the GLAM sector and film and arts sector hold a lot of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous data. And finally, industry holds a lot of Indigenous data. So what we want to do is ensure that we have not the siloed ad hoc processes of trying to interpret different ways of implementing Indigenous data governance. We want really practical and pragmatic tools of embedding this across all institutions that hold this data. We also want to improve discoverability via distributed catalogues, but also maintaining an ability for communities to be able to find out where is that data that was collected 10 years ago, 5 years ago. How do I access that data? How do I govern that data? We also want to stop the replication of research that goes on in data collection. We are also aiming to develop a variety of frameworks for rematriation and preservation of data, and to expand Indigenous-led training and capacity building. Thanks. So what have we done so far? As I said, we've matured quite significantly. Our partnerships have grown across Australia, but also internationally. We've built numerous catalogue tools, including a variety of metadata standards. We've developed a variety of training programs and internships that we've been running across the breadth of the project, which continue to expand and evolve as we learn more in the building of this infrastructure. And I will tell you next about some of our case studies, because the project just keeps getting bigger and bigger. So if we go to the next slide, Boyega. So I'm just going to tell you about one of our international partnerships and the context of it and where we see it going in the future. So we're partnering with several French institutions and also a couple of Yolngu organisations in Arnhem Land. And this particular case study we're calling the Living Legacies Digital Rematriation of the Carol Kupka collections. Now, for those of you who don't know who Carol Kupka is, which not everyone apart from those who might be focusing on Indigenous art, or if you're from Arnhem Land, a lot of people know who Carol Kupka is. Carol Kupka was, he lived between 1918 and 1993. He was a Czech-born artist who became an ethnologist and collector after moving to France. Kupka was fascinated by the origins of art, and he travelled to Australia in the 1950s to study Aboriginal painting traditions. Kupka undertook major collecting trips between 1956 and 64, during what's considered the golden age of bark painting. He worked mainly in Milingimbi, which is a small island in the Crocodile Islands, and other communities in Arnhem Land, documenting artists and their works in detail. He was among the first internationally, beyond Indigenous people themselves, to recognise individual Aboriginal painters as artists rather than anonymous makers. Now, Kupka assembled one of the most significant collections of bark paintings and objects from Northern Australia. These include ceremonial figurative works by master painters such as Marwalan Marika, David Malangi and others. But where are they now? Well, his collections are dispersed across many major institutions, both nationally and internationally. There's a large proportion of Kupka's collection in Paris at the Musée de Quai Branly, Jacques Chirac. But there is also another major repository at the Museum de Culture in Basel, Switzerland. And there is also some works in institutions across museums and archives in Australia. Now, the Living Legacies case study includes scientific meetings, training programs and collaborative workshops to advance standards for Indigenous data governance and new curatorial practices. So some of the work that we are doing and have been doing is working with initially the Milingimbi Art and Culture Centre in Milingimbi, who have their own digital repository of some of the artwork and objects and photos that were taken away in earlier years. They're on a serious campaign to repatriate these at least digital artefacts back to the community, because they're in the process of a reinvigoration of artists in the community. So there are several younger artists who are wanting access to their ancestors' paintings, and although there is some travel that is happening internationally so that they can access these physical items, it's not always possible. Resources are not that plentiful. However, they have found that Milingimbi Art Centre over the last 5 or 6 years has become reinvigorated by this bringing together of a collection of the digital art. So some of the artists coming out of Milingimbi at the moment are some of the most exciting in the country, reinterpreting some of the old stories of their kinship connections, and it's an absolutely fascinating hub of art activity. So we are working with Milingimbi Art and Culture and also with institutions including the Musée de Quai Branly and CNRS in Paris to do some of this work of repatriating the works that are held in these institutions. So far we've held several workshops and ongoing meetings. Oh, it's gone through, yeah. So in August this year, we held a co-located event in Darwin at the Darwin Aboriginal Art Fair, which is the biggest Aboriginal art fair in Australia. It was the first time I'd been there. It's absolutely gobsmacking. There's over 80 Aboriginal art centres from around Australia that come together and represent their works. So we did have a co-located event there with artists and gallery curators, a variety of different people from different institutions across Australia, but also our partners in France, to come together and start talking about some of these issues related to not just the data itself that's held in institutions all over the country, but also thinking through issues of the knowledge that is held in these artworks and trying to think through a variety of different ways of repatriating these back to the communities of origin. So we had representatives from the National Museum of Australia. There was our partner from the Musée de Quai Branly, our partner from CNRS in Paris, but also, as I said, some of the artists came down from Milingimbi. So it was an anthropologist, linguist. There was a variety of really, really fruitful discussions within our workshop and a public symposium we held. The second part of that workshop we're holding actually in 2 weeks in Paris. So we're going over and we're holding another workshop and public symposium at the Musée de Quai Branly. Our collaborators in Milingimbi are coming over with us, and they will access the archives in the Musée de Quai Branly, and then they will travel on to Basel in Switzerland to also access the materials there. So it's a relatively slow process, but it's unpacking some of these issues when data is held, or even in this instance, artworks are held across international borders. How do we manage that? So this is a significant part of the work of this particular case study. Another case study I'd like to highlight is the work we've been doing up in northeast Arnhem Land in Yirrkala, working with the Yirrkala Bilingual School. So those of you who don't know much about Yirrkala or its history, and in particular this school, which is actually a fairly well-known school for being one of the first bilingual Indigenous schools in the nation and longest running. It's not the first, but one of the longest running. So it's situated in the remote Indigenous community of Yirrkala, which I think I've kind of pointed out there. You might be able to get a grasp of that. In northeast Arnhem Land, which is in the Northern Territory. And Yirrkala really holds a unique place in our collective history of Australia. At the core of the Yirrkala School, this educational institution lies the Literature Production Centre, and the Literature Production Centre is really a vital and cherished space within the community, and it's dedicated to the preservation and celebration of the Yolngu linguistic heritage. So to give a brief history of that school, in the 1960s, the first mission school was established in Yirrkala, and it laid the foundation for education in the region. In 1963, the Yirrkala Bark petition initiated discussions on Yolngu education and advocated for change. Then in 1966, the Yirrkala School transitioned to a Commonwealth Government administration, and which at the time also increased Indigenous control over education, transitioning it away from that missionary model. Then came 1972, and bilingual education was inaugurated by Gough Whitlam, the Prime Minister at the time, to preserve Indigenous language and cultures in the education system and to ensure that Indigenous peoples maintain their language and actually were able to learn through their first languages. Then in 1974, the Yirrkala School initiated bilingual education in the school, teaching in both Yolngu Mata and in English. And then in 1976, there was an on-site teacher education and literature production centre for quality education and culturally relevant materials that was established. So it really does have a long history. In the Literature Production Centre, Yolngu educators and non-Indigenous educators have worked for that period of time to produce a variety of bilingual resources to teach the children in the school. They've developed all of the materials, the way they do this, and they embed cultural learning and cultural knowledge in the education process for all of their students. And they have been highly active in maintaining this in perpetuity, despite some terrible events along the way where successive governments really did try to pull this out of the schools, which essentially they just ignored and carried on. So as you can imagine, their archive actually holds a nationally significant and really, really rich archive of not just these cultural and linguistic resources, but over time, a lot of people in the region also deposited materials beyond the educational resources to include anything from every variety of audio-visual material that you could imagine. There are topographical maps from very early days. There are photos in there from the 1930s when some of the anthropologists were coming through and taking photos. There's everything you can imagine sitting in that archive, and obviously of great national significance. Now, so really the LPC itself has evolved and it's grown into an invaluable repository, accumulating a vast and diverse collection. But this growth has also revealed the limitations of the actual LPC's design and capacity, and underscores the pressing need for expansion or alternative accommodation to cater to its ever-growing needs. Another significant issue of why we've been working with this particular community is that because of where it's located in Northern Australia, it's really, really at risk to environmental hazards. Whether we're talking about cyclones, floods, the humidity up there. When we first started working in Yirrkala, I think it was in 2022, the summer holidays, there had been a massive flood through the school. When we went in there, there was water that was, I think, probably 15 centimetres high in the archive room, and material was being destroyed and damaged. We could also tell that there was significant black mould that was growing in the room, and all of that material is at risk of being lost forever. So the people of Yirrkala and the 7 clans who have contributed to that particular archive hold it very closely to their hearts. They want it there for their future generations. So we've been working to digitise and to work with the Yolngu people and the leadership within the school to both digitise and catalogue that material. It's a long and slow process. We're trying to build capacity within the school itself so that they can maintain it themselves and continue on when we complete this process. But we're also making sure that we bring up a variety of people to make sure we have the expertise to do it properly. However, in such a remote place and in such a low resource setting, there are a variety of different things we've had to think through and do quite pragmatically. And as Nick sort of mentioned earlier, you know, digitisation can be a little bit of the dirty word, but it is so vital. And, you know, Yirrkala is not the only place where there is at-risk material. This is all over the country. Anything from the difficulties of digitising old VHS tapes is significant. So we've also been partnering with the Art Centre in Yirrkala, the Bukulange Art Centre and the Muka Project, because they have a fabulous technique of buying old VHS recorders off eBay and they've come up with a very good technique of digitising this material. We've also been bringing up postgrad archival students and a variety of other students. Even getting the equipment up to Yirrkala is quite challenging. So we've been bringing up maybe between 4 to 8 volunteers and interns at a time over 2-week periods. It's very expensive getting people up there. It's quite boring work. So we have been training some of the Yolngu teacher educators and other young community members, but it's hard to sustain sitting in a room just scanning paper over and over again. So we're getting through it. And also in terms of the cataloguing process, it's really enriching the work of the project as well as hopefully creating a really useful resource for them, because we figure if the tooling we're creating works in a community like Yirrkala, hopefully it should work everywhere. So that's another thing I really want to emphasise, is that we really are trying very hard to make sure that all of the work we do starts from the community up and benefits communities first. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I better start talking quickly because I realise I've taken a whole lot of time. Okay, I'll just quickly talk about another case study of the partnership that we have in Macassar. So for those of you who don't know about the long relationship between Northern Australia and the Macassan population, Macassan, it really began at, well, probably earlier, but from what we know at this stage, around the early 1700s and lasted through until sort of early 1900s, although on the down low there's still probably quite a bit that goes on, when the Australian government banned the trade that was occurring between Macassan fishermen and the people of Northern Australia under the Immigration Restriction Act. So Macassan fishermen from Sulawesi sailed annually to Arnhem Land, and they called Arnhem Land Merege to harvest trepang, which are sea cucumber, for trade with China. Now, the Yolngu people of Arnhem Land provided labour and local knowledge, and Macassans exchanged goods such as metal, tools, cloth, tobacco and rice. And these metal tools really were transformative for Yolngu life, establishing anything from dugout canoe construction to new art forms. So there's a really rich and old relationship and history between the people of Arnhem Land and Macassar. So in the work we're doing here, we've travelled to Macassar to meet with experts in Macassan universities, including Hassanuddin University, the Macassan State University, and also the Merege Institute, where there's a lot of work going on there by linguists who are studying some of the old texts that not many people understand anymore in Lontara, and are starting to reinterpret what they think actually some of this meant. So when I say it's probably earlier than 1700, we're on the edge of all sorts of discoveries, which is fascinating. But the other thing that we really are interested in is that there's a lot of knowledge that's held and data that's held on both sides of in Macassar and in Australia that isn't shared. So we're exploring ways of how we share that data across borders to enrich the data on both sides and the knowledge and understanding of our histories. Yeah, do you want to click? And I'm not going to talk about these in extent because I need to pass to the others to have a talk. But we've had quite a few events and that work is ongoing as well. And I'll pass to Boyega. Sorry, Boyega.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you very much. Before I get on to talking about the ANU First Nations Portfolio Indigenous Metadata Catalog that a product that we've recently developed at the ANU, I will give a very brief history of the nature of our relationship with the RSU and this project in particular. So one of the mandates by the ANU given to the First Nations portfolio was to support the university in implementing ONDRIP. This was like 5-6 years ago in the ANU plan. And one of the ways that the First Nations portfolio tried to approach that is through the implementation of the Indigenous Data Initiative. And that links to all the work being done at the ISU. So the three key objectives of the initiative are, number one, to create a keeping place for all Indigenous research data at the ANU. The second is to produce the metadata catalog, which will enable the university and all the data custodians on campus to have a central sort of repository where Indigenous research data can be searched and accessed. And the third part is around developing some sort of capabilities to, first of all, be able to search and access these materials, and eventually begin the process of rematriation. So we have been able to build the catalog successfully and also create the keeping place, which both sits at the NCI on campus. So I just want to talk about the workshop. So we had a demo workshop in May 2025 this year, just a few months ago. And we brought together, it was internal, we brought together all the data custodians on campus. So from the libraries to the archives, representatives from the archives, all the way to ARIS, which I think they call them RP Research Portal Plus now. So they hold all the historical publication metadata for the ANU. So we asked them two questions based on the design of the catalog itself. So the catalog, I'll just go very quickly about the catalog. It has two ways that it can be searched. The first is the traditional text-based search. And the second is through different query development. So the reason that was a part of the design of the project is to encourage some sort of complex questions that you can't generally get through a Boolean search or through a text search, but you are able to get through query, SPARQL query development. So here, just a very simple So at the top, the image at the top just shows the data, sort of data architecture of the ANU. So one of the things we did before we got to this, it took us like 3 years, 2.5 to 3 years to be able to access at the superstructural level of the university, all the data custodians, and for them to release the data that they hold. So this is just what the catalog looks like conceptually, and below is the knowledge graph that we have developed. So instead of the traditional relational database, we have used, because it's a linked data project, we've used a relatively more sophisticated knowledge graph method, which helps in a lot of ways to bring together varying forms of metadata assets. So yeah, there's a lot of text here. Like I said, over the past 3 years, we have been able to 3 primary data sources at the university, the largest data sources. We have over 1 million records in the catalog itself. About 500,000 to 600,000 records of those came from ARIS. Again, they've changed the name now. They are Research Portal Plus. So this is a little bit dated. Then the ANU thesis collection is another set of records that we have, and which comprises of all the thesis, PhD, masters, and I think a few honors research theses. I think that's about 15,000 records that are there from the thesis, and the library. So all the bibliographic records from the library from library holdings across the university. There are also, in the process of digging and searching for what we consider to be orphaned data, we started to come across data that are like the Briscoe-Smith archive, that are completely non-digitized, locked away in the basement of the ANU archive. There are also other business units across campus that have their own library and have their own databases like police. And so we were able to access and ingest those information. Thank you. Yeah, and there's also the ANU Compendium of Indigenous Research that we're also able to access. So there are several databases on campus that we continue to try to have access to and clean them up and ingest them into the catalog. So part of the future development work that we are currently looking at is to continue to enrich the catalog. So we're already in conversation with ANU Collections for their metadata records, which is currently run under a different system called Pure, because it's much more granular and has richer details that can help us to improve the graph database. So I'll put this, one of the big projects we're trying to get onto next year is around the ANU calendars and the ANU reports. The ANU calendars and ANU reports are historical records of the university from its inception. In 1948, there are administrative records, academic information, all sorts of information in these records, and they go from 1951 to I think 1985. So what we're trying to do is we consider that as a trove of really highly important information. that can help us in improving how we tag indigenous materials and also how we continue to enrich the knowledge graph. So we're hoping to work with some of our colleagues on campus to begin that process of extracting information. We tried doing it by manually. It was definitely too difficult. So we did a couple of years just to be able to see what was the structure of the university, the changes that has happened over the years, and how individuals have moved across the university over a period of time. So that is one of the further work that we're hoping to do. In addition to that, we are also looking at ongoing testing and refinement of the catalog. It's certainly imperfect, but there is a lot of work to do, and we want it to be the next set of refinements to be user-driven. So we're relying a lot on the sort of questions that users, researchers, indigenous communities, some of the data stewards and custodians on campus as well, continuing to ask how the catalog can benefit their work. But we see that as a two-way sort of learning. I think, yep, that's me.
Now, Fina is just going to talk really quickly. We've run out of time. Sorry, Fina, about our data.
No worries. Hi, everyone. I'll just quickly run through our Indigenous Data Thon that happened last month. We just want to highlight this because it was our inaugural event and it did go really, really well. So we just want to highlight some of the great feedback that we received. But last month we had a wide range of individuals come through to test and play with some of the data. And you can see our great partners on the screen there. But we'll head on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we had 42 register for the event. We had 31 participants in the end because we had a few that didn't attend, but we also had some that came up on the day. So 31 was a really great outcome for us. And on the day, we also had 10 incredible mentors and 5 volunteers that supported the operation. And the focus area for the participants were Indigenous data, integrity and quality, heart and health monitoring, ICU service features, and Indigenous experience in sepsis ICU admissions. Thank you. So this was our winning team here that their work was understanding pathways and outcomes for Indigenous patients who received RRT in ICU. We've uploaded a publication on our website with some more information on the winning team, so you can have a look at that there. But we'll just get onto the feedback from the applicants so you can see how the day went as a whole. So the net promoter score we got was 53, which was a really, really good outcome for us. So majority of the participants would recommend that event to friends, family, colleagues. So having that score come through was really great. Anyone that's running an event, a really great piece of feedback is to get the participants to do the feedback survey on the day. We kind of put up a QR code and everyone was already sitting there, and it had a really high participation rate, which is great for us. And then these are just some of the key themes that came through. So everyone really enjoyed the collaboration, teamwork, working together, knowledge of skills. We had a few keynote speakers, including Marcia and Dr. Shay Springfield. Those are up online as well. And also we had Kristen speak. So having those knowledge experts there, the mentors that had the data from ANZICS and IATSIS, so having them there supporting the teams, everyone learning was really beneficial to everyone. Those are the key themes. For next year, we've got a few improvements, definitely time and structure. Having the participants meet beforehand would be really good so they could learn who everyone is. And then just a little bit more clarity on what the presentation was. And then, yeah, so overall it's a really, really great day, and we look forward to running the next event, and we are in the midst of working on wrap up and working on towards working for new events in the future. Thank you.
And we're nearly at the end. Sorry, everyone. I had hoped to have a little bit more time to take you through some of the catalogue tools, but I do believe one of our technical leads, Nick Carr, is speaking tomorrow on one of these elements. But this is just a snapshot. Unfortunately, the QR code seems to have dropped off. But we'd love you to go on and have a look at our website where all of our tools we just put up there as we go. We're changing them and adapting as we go along. But if you'd like to have a look, the website is idnau.org. So I'd really encourage you all to go in and trial them. We're really open to feedback. As I said, we are wanting to be adaptive and reflexive to ensure that all of these tools are useful for everyone. Let's just click through these. These are just this is the IDN catalogue model. This is our metadata entry form with our care and scare, I can't even talk, our fair and care scoring tool, scare. We also have a spatial, geospatial catalogue that has a searchable tool using polygons. And I think Nick is going to talk a little bit more about some of the fuzzy mapping techniques tomorrow. We also have, we've been developing a research data management capability maturity model, a self-assessment tool that we've been testing it across universities that isn't openly available yet, but we're nearly there in releasing it so everyone can have access to that. But just wrapping up, really, in terms of, we could have been here all day talking about the work that's been done in this project. We've only just scratched the surface of what has been done across all the different partner organisations. We're really feel that we're at this point in time where we've matured, that it is time for us to become a capability standing on its own. So, which was mentioned briefly by Kylie this morning. So watch this space. You know, it really has matured into a really powerful network of relationships between, you know, universities, data custodians, cultural institutions, and most importantly, Aboriginal and community controlled organisations and peoples themselves. And these partnerships are a foundation of everything that we do and what we've achieved so far. And looking ahead, our vision is to deepen and expand these collaborations. And what I really want to emphasise that this isn't just about technology, it's about trust, reciprocity, and Indigenous-led governance. And that's what we're all about. So as I said, we could go on forever, but we won't. So thank you very much for listening to us today.